Hello, I'm Olivia Mattis. Thank you for giving us an hour of your Sunday to join us for an exceptional story today. We have had you see the film, the unique film telling the unique story, No Place on Earth, of these 38 people who lived underground in Ukraine for 511 days. It's breathtaking. The story is breathtaking. The way the story was discovered is breathtaking. And the way the story is portrayed on film is also breathtaking. So we have the three perfect people to explore all aspects of this story. We have the man, Chris Nicola, who discovered this cave, discovered the story behind the cave, who spent 10 years of his life researching what happened in that cave. So he's here to talk to you and to answer your questions. We have the filmmaker, Janet Tobias, who made this sweeping, just monumental film with recreations and just every detail, attention to every detail. And she's also here to tell you what went into the making of the film. And then we have a beneficiary of the story, the granddaughter of one of the people who lived in the cave. And she herself went back to the cave for the making of the film. So it's Chris Nicola, Janet Tobias, the filmmaker, and Erin Grunstein Halpern, the granddaughter of Saul Sturmer. They're all here for you today. So right now, I'm going to turn the floor over to Chris Nicola. Chris, welcome. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Shalom. And first of all, thank you for the opportunity to let me tell you a story, to quote Saul Sturmer, a story that he always used to say, a story that needs to be told. Okay, are we ready for the first slide? Okay, as most of you know by now, this story took place in Ukraine, specifically around that red encircled area in the slide, in part of what is Western Ukraine today. But it's important to keep in mind that prior to the Second World War, that area, historically known as Galicia, was part of Poland. Okay, I first got involved in this project in '93 when I was invited as one of the first Americans after the collapse of communism to visit the area to study the caves I read about, Priest Grotto being one of the many caves that I read about. Here, this is the original entrance. It was a little surprising. I couldn't get into the original entrance because the original entrance, because of mudslides and erosion and winter snowfall, had closed. There have been several collapses. But in the early 60s, the local cavers found steam, sort of, or warm air coming up, and they opened up a passageway into it. So there's another entrance in. Now, shortly after I entered the cave in '93, again, keep in mind, I went there knowing nothing about a story about people living in a cave. I went there to study the geology. But within an hour of being in a cave, I was startled of the things I was finding, like these artifacts: a woman's shoe, a drinking mug, a key, some pottery shards, evidence that someone had been in that cave. But nobody that was traveling with me, the locals, couldn't give me any information about where these things came from. And this became a mystery. Years later, I would learn with the pottery shards. If you look real close at the pottery shards, each piece of pottery had a unique design on it. That became very important 10 years later when Peter Taylor and I, in a National Geographic expedition, went back and we photographed the artifacts, we photographed the cave. And one of the problems Peter and I always had in interviewing the survivors was to show the survivors a map of the cave made 70 years later and ask them to trace it and tell us what their daily routine consisted of. They couldn't do it. But then we discovered that each family had a unique pattern on their chinaware. And when we showed them the photos of the china we found, and Peter and I had plotted the china on a map, we knew where the base camps were, and then the survivors could actually take us through a daily routine. Now, here, Michal Shahatsky, the curator of the local museum, Borshoff, was showing us one of the first maps made of the cave in the 1890s by some archaeologists visiting from Krakow that made a startling discovery. Evidence, such as the pottery shards shown to the right, that as far back as 2,000 years ago, the local people would survive invading armies by taking refuge in the cave. What's important to note here, in regards to the 38 people the movie told you about, every one of them learned that fact in elementary school, so they knew it could be done. Now, shortly after, I shouldn't say shortly, as mentioned, it took 10 years before I finally got some concrete proof that what I heard from a little old lady in the village in 93, that maybe some Jews lived in the cave during the Holocaust, was true. And then I happened to find Saul Wexler, the nephew of Esther Sturmer, and Saul was just living 7 miles away from me in New York City. And from Saul, I got a copy of Esther's memoirs. I also got a listing of who was in each of the 2 caves. Here you see the survivors that were in Priest Grotto Cave. It was on with this information that Peter Taylor and I, the co-author of the book, we went to National Geographic and we spoke to him about funding an expedition with the hopes to get an article in National Geographic magazine. So what waited for him underground? Well, you saw the video. There were a lot of things that waited for him, but some of them, and keep in mind also, they went in as amateurs. They knew nothing about caving. But as you probably figured out, looking at the video, over the weeks and months they were underground, through trial and error and thinking out of the box, they taught themselves to be world-class cavers. They had to deal with the temperature, about 50 degrees, meaning it was dangerous and you got hypothermia. Basically, your body shuts down because of the coldness, and it could be fatal. They had to deal with bats that defecated on the floor of the cave in certain spots, haven for disease. They had, could we get the list of things they had to deal with? But they also had to deal with, like I said, isolation. They had to deal with water. In the first cave, there was none. The second cave, they were lucky enough. They had a lake. They had all the water they needed. They tried to cook several times. The first times were very dangerous. In one case, Esther went to wake up her granddaughter after she finished cooking a meal for her, and she found out her granddaughter was not sleeping. Her granddaughter was suffocating off the smoke. But eventually, they found an area in the cave where there was a natural draft, and they figured out an ingenious way to build these ovens and stoves in such a way that the chimneys would take advantage of the natural draft of the cave and bring the smoke away from them, so it could actually cook in the cave. But in 2002, 10 years it took me to start to find survivors. In 2002, there were 15 of the original 38 alive. And I had a chance to ask all but one of them, how do you explain the fact that you survived against all odds? Some of them said it was the strong will of Esther Sturmer. Others said it was something up above or something watching over them. A few said it was Nissel Sturmer's military training for having been in the Polish cavalry for 4 years. But the number one common answer they all gave was when they looked to the left and they saw the mother and father. They looked to the right, they saw the children. They looked in front of them, they saw the grandparents. It was family. It was the family bond. They had no choice. That's what gave them the strength to survive. In addition to the discipline they got from having a belief system, their religion. Those two things tied together, they all agreed were the strongest things to keep them alive and help them to survive. Here you see one of the 5 families, the featured family in the documentary in the book, the Sturmer family. As you would know from having watched the video, the Sturmers went in the cave in Priest Grotto Cave in 1943, and Esther went in with her 3 sons, her son-in-law, her 3 daughters, and her 2 granddaughters, who were 4 and 9, including Sonia here to the right. And I'm proud to say, every 3 to 5 months, I still talk to Sonia. She lives in Long Island as part of the time in Florida. So I still keep that relationship going. And again, this is one of the 5 families that lived in Priest Grotto Cave. One of the things that Peter Taylor and I found on the 2003 National Geographic funded expedition was what I call the piece de resistance in terms of artifacts. One of the main tools that Esther mentioned helped keep all the families alive. This is an 80+ pound millstone that Nissel, Esther's eldest son, carried on his back through the snow over, I believe, 5 miles, and he brought it into the cave. And this allowed all the families to grind things like beets and potatoes, mix that with water from the lake, and they could even make their own bread. So this is one of the key tools that Esther always said helped them all survive. Next slide. A few yards from the millstone, there's a tunnel that leads to some other areas, including the sleeping area where the Sturmers and their families stayed at night, and also gives access to the rest of the cave. Now, the Sturmers and the others didn't know at the time, but they had discovered one of the longest caves in the world back then. Back then, it was the 4th longest cave, and today it measures over 90 miles. In a remote area of the cave. Now, remember, I didn't have any names of who was in the cave until I met Saul Wexler in 2002, and he shared Esther's memoirs with me. And then Peter and I went back to the cave in 2003, the Nat Geo shoot. And I remembered at some point, years before, about 10 years before, there was a remote area of the cave where I saw some names on the wall. So Peter and I went there, and there were the names that matched the names in Esther's memoirs. Sturmer, Dodick down to the left, Wexelblad, which was actually, Wexel was the anglicized version of Wexelblad. The names were on the ceiling of the cave. Interestingly enough, years later, I will be interviewing Mundik Rebel, who's the one who put the names on the cave. And I asked him, you spoke Yiddish in the cave. Why didn't you put it in Yiddish? And he said, well, in Esther's book, she mentioned that if they got out of the cave, they didn't know if Judaism or Hebrew would even be in existence anymore. But Esther always felt whoever wrote the story of the cave would write it in German or Russian. So Mundik looked at me and said, you think if we wrote it in Yiddish, anybody would have translated it? We wrote it the way we did to ensure that if we never made it out of the cave, our story would. And Esther mentioned that was the second most important thing. They actually planned for the demise. Next slide. Now, National Geographic, when they first heard the story that Peter Taylor and I were giving them, they looked at us in a rather skeptical manner. And at one point they said, before we even promise to print one word of what you guys are telling us in an article, we're going to send you back, and we want you to come back with physical evidence that this story took place the way you said it did. Now, look very closely at that 4-3. If you look close, you'll see some white smudges over the 4 and 3. Those white smudges result from a natural process that takes place in caves where minerals leach out of rock and cover the surface. The interesting thing is that in this cave, that process takes 60 to 70 years to occur. So whoever wrote 1943 wrote it around 1943. We had our physical evidence for National Geographic. And then what happened is Nat Geo, next slide, please. They printed an article. And then shortly after the article got printed, it was actually one of the longest articles in Nat Geo Adventure Magazine. It was the June and July edition, 2004. And shortly after that appeared, Peter Taylor and I were contacted by Carbon Publishing, and that led to the book deal. And we ended up publishing The Secret of Priest Grotto. Next slide. And then several years later, through introduction from Peter Taylor, I met a very unique and talented woman, Janet Tobias. And Janet's going to tell you shortly how she took the story of the Sturmers from the written word and put it on screen But one last thought I'd like to share with you. One of the most frequent questions that I get at presentations like this, and I'm sure I can speak for Janet also, both of us non-Jews, is what was your greatest reward? And I think Janet will agree with me, and I know Peter would. Our greatest reward as 3 non-Jews were that 5 Jewish families got enough faith, trust, and confidence in us to use their own words, to tell the story they couldn't tell themselves. And now Janet's going to tell you how she put that story on film.
Thank you, Chris. And I do feel exactly that it was only possible with the trust of a very big extended family of multi-generations. So No Place on Earth was my first feature film. I've now gone off to make a number of others, but basically I had an early career as a journalist. I started at 60 Minutes. I was Diane Sawyer's associate producer and then youngest producer. And I had a career at the networks and then ran a show on PBS. And then I took a detour and had a career in sort of medicine and health and technology, but I miss storytelling. And so when Peter Taylor came to me with this story, I thought, this is the most incredible story I've ever heard, and I want to make a feature film. So I'll take you now through that process, which is pre-production, taking the survivors and family back to Ukraine, and then our reenactments. So the pre-production part was it even possible to take the survivors back to Ukraine? So with Chris, we went on a trip about a year before we went to film and to descend into Priest Grotto. And it was a very narrow entrance, which you went down a ladder and then you went down a narrow wall. And I will say that at that time, my business partner was a former attack Marine helicopter pilot who'd gone to Harvard Business School, and he got sort of claustrophobic, just to give you a sense at that entrance, and then it expands out into the rooms that you see. But we ultimately determined that, yes, it was possible to go back and to film both in that cave and in Verteba, the first cave, which was easier because it had an open entrance. But as leaving, I decided that I wanted to do one thing. Is I had never been to a concentration camp. And so since I exited Ukraine into Poland, I went to Auschwitz. And in Auschwitz, I saw all the pictures of the people who lived long enough to get numbers and have their pictures taken. And in that moment, it crystallized to me that person after person had no one to tell their story. That hundreds and thousands and millions of stories of children and grandparents and women and men were never going to be told. And that there was an incredible moral obligation to tell any story, let alone a story that was this good. So fast forward to a year later, the survivors decided that they would return to the cave. At that point, Nissel, the oldest brother, was dead. I had not met him, nor had Chris, because he died before any of us started on this journey. But Saul Sturmer was the oldest, the middle brother, and Sam Sturmer, the youngest brother in the Sturmer family, and then their nieces, Sonia and Seema. And they all decided to come back. They all brought one family member with them. Saul brought his granddaughter, Erin Grunstein-Halpern, who you're going to hear from in a second. Sam brought his daughter, Lila, and Sonia and Seema brought their husbands, David and Harold. And so we returned to Karlovka and Bilchazlata and the caves. We were all really concerned about the survivors. This was, you could feel their anxiety about going back. They were going to a place where people had tried to kill them and tried to slaughter all of the people of their beliefs. And so we, I think that worried all of us. But the survivors both, I think, had very emotional moments and good and hard moments in the time there. In the village, I will say, people weren't running to say hello. There were almost no old men in this area of Ukraine, and in fact, in Ukraine as a whole, most of the men died during World War II, so there really aren't very many old men left. There were some old women, no one really talked to us about the story. So no one really greeted the survivors, but we proceeded then to go into the caves. We went into Verteba, and my favorite moment, maybe in the whole film, is when Saul Sturmer says, "Please turn out the lights. Now I can see, now I know where I am," because how he navigated in the cave was in the dark. So the cave was foreign with all the lights and the cameras and the equipment. And when we went to Priest Grotto, I think at that point we knew Sonia and Seema had already decided that they couldn't physically do it and didn't want to do it. And Saul decided that it was also too much when he got there. Sam, for a second, thought about it, but he got frightened, and it was too much emotionally for him. And so Chris turned to Saul and said, essentially, "This is your legacy. Let the grandchildren, let Aaron and Cliff, who was Nissel, the older brother's son, a grandson, go down." And so they descended in the cave, as you can see in the film. Lighting the cave was an incredibly complex exercise. Cables run through water down into the cave. We had a team of 30 to 40 people who worked on this return. We had an ambulance and a doctor. I think Aaron knows this. We had an ambulance outside the cave and a doctor in case any of the survivors would have medical emergencies, either emotional or physical. So it was a quite huge expedition. So fast forward to that winter, and we started to film the reenactments. We filmed them in the winter and the spring. And we did not film them in Ukraine because we had both better access to more actors and also to more manageable sites for filming, both in caves and in villages that existed that we thought could work for us. Because during the reenactment, we also had 40 to 50 people. When you have costumers, you have makeup people, you have child actors, you have a quite huge range. And I will tell one slightly funny story, which is in site surveying caves to do this, is I was taken, not with Chris, but by some world-class cavers to site survey. And they took me some incredibly difficult places where you had to crawl in tiny areas with water running over you. And finally, at the end of this, I said, there is no way we're bringing 50 people and 10 child actors into these places. And they realized I was so upset that they ran to a hut and brought me schnapps and a kitten that they threw on my shoulder. So the running joke with me now is if you want to calm the director down, you can always get a kitten and some schnapps. So, and that will work. So, but we ended up with a really big cave in northern Hungary on the border of Slovakia and with villages outside of Budapest. The lead actress who played Esther Sturmer is well known in Hungary with Jewish ancestry. But many of the actors were actually novices. The children all were novices, and some of the person playing Nissel Sturmer was a novice. The young man playing Saul Sturmer actually was also a decently known actor in Hungary. And so the filming in the winter was really hard. It was incredibly cold, which made all of us appreciate what the survivors had been able to accomplish and what the young men had to deal with going out to get food. My director of cinematography actually lit his socks on fire, trying to put his feet close to a small light in that process. But that just emphasized to all of us what incredible abilities the young men had when they went out of the cave to navigate through weather, danger, logistics at a level that I think is really beyond amazing, that they were able to coordinate and deal with so many things. So that is essentially, the reenactment was filmed in 2 waves. And then we put the film together, and then we had the good fortune of submitting it to the Toronto Film Festival, and it got in. And so one of my really happy memories is of survivors and children and grandchildren all watching the film at the Toronto Film Festival And one of the two main papers in Toronto had an article where they talked about all of the survivors and what they had accomplished. Needless to say, I fell in love with filmmaking, making this film. I fell in love with the Sturmer family. Like Chris, I still talk to Sonia. I talked to her this week. And as I hand off to Erin, Erin can say is that her great aunt said, "You must read my mother's book, my grandmother's book," because Sonia still rereads the book, and the memories are as fresh as yesterday for Sonia, who was about 8 years old in the cave.
So now it's my turn. Hi, everyone. I did reread the book actually this weekend. I just wanted everything to be fresh and clear in my mind as well. And wow, every time I reread it, I'm just wowed by it. I hope you've been inspired by hearing and watching my grandfather and his family's story. But now let's backtrack a bit. I didn't discover the story. I was shaped by the story from the moment I was born. If you see, these are my family members here. They're not just heroic strangers whose story I just happen to have heard. This is a photo of my great-grandparents, Esther and Shabsi Sturmer, with their 6 children, son-in-law, and eldest granddaughter, Sonia. I never had the chance to meet my great-grandmother, Esther, but I'm very proud to be named in her honor. Babi Esther documented the family story in 1960 by hand in Yiddish. This is a photocopy of her manuscript. My grandfather was always very proud to say she wrote the whole thing, didn't erase one word, and just wrote it, and the whole story is there. Her manuscript was translated into English and was printed by our family. My grandparents gifted me a copy at the age of 8. In the inscription, my grandmother wrote to me, it wrote that Babi Esther, her wish was that all her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren should have her book. So I look forward to one day sharing this with my kids. My oldest just turned 9, so they're almost ready. But I shared this book with my family, and through this book, my husband's grandfather, who came to Canada at the age of 3, finally found out what happened in his hometown of Zaleszczyki. So that was quite an amazing connection. Yesterday, as I was looking at the book, I was really struck yet again by my great-grandmother, Babi Esther's foresight. They actually had booked passage on September 8th, 1939, on a boat to Canada. Unfortunately, as we know, what happened on September 1st, the war broke out. They weren't able to leave. But I mentioned this to my mother, and she said that had they gotten out, there are very slim chances that Sonia and Sima, my grandfather's little nieces, whose family didn't have passage booked, would have survived. This was so jarring and shocking to me. They've built such beautiful families. They're my cousins. We're related. We see each other. And just imagine it having all been lost, and just all the families and all the people who never came to be. Anyhow, I don't remember the first time I heard the story. It wasn't really like that. My grandfather was always telling anecdotes. We would go to my grandparents' house for dinner every Thursday night, and it was what we spoke about around the table. Now, you would think this is inappropriate for a young child, but the stories were never told in a scary way. They were really told as adventures. And as a child and then preteen, I was really unaware of how extraordinary my grandfather's story was. I did, however, ask my grandfather to come speak to my class when I was in 3rd grade for Yom HaShoah, which is Holocaust Remembrance Day. I begged him to come, but he wasn't very comfortable speaking publicly, and he had never done it. But the truth is, as you could probably see from the film, he was a fantastic storyteller. And so he finally relented and really mesmerized my class. I actually noticed in the chat, a few of you guys were asking like where they used the bathroom. And that was a question that I had never even thought to ask, but the students in my class had asked him. And he was so shocked that someone even thought to ask him the question, but they would go, they would just have an area that would be the bathroom for a while. And then I guess at a certain point where it was dirty enough, they would just find a new area to use as their bathroom. I hope that answered that question. Anyhow, so my teacher that year called him every year afterwards to ask him to speak again, but he never came again. So all this to say is maybe at some point I did know this was a very special story. Slowly as I got older, I started realizing this wasn't a typical survival story. When I was in high school, after Chris had discovered us and really brought the story to the world, there was a photo of my grandfather and his siblings on the front page of the major Montreal English language newspaper. And firstly, my first reaction when I saw it was, oy vey, his socks. He was wearing these like white socks pulled up. But anyhow, I was able to take this article and this photo and use it for a world history project. And that was quite a turning point for me, where I realized like, wow, this isn't just another story. This is quite an incredible story. Now, before the story was discovered, my grandparents went back to the Ukraine twice prior in the early 90s, but they never made it into the cave. I mention this because I cannot allow a presentation to go by without telling one of my grandfather's favorite stories. I'm sure Janet and Chris, you're smiling already. You know what I'm going to say. So during the war, at one point, my grandfather and his brother, they were hungry. They wanted to have a piece of meat. So who could blame them? They're boys in their 20s. So they decided to go and steal a sheep. They found, or perhaps they made, a hole in a fence, and they grabbed a sheep, but they threw it back because it was too skinny. So they tried again. This time they got a nice fat sheep. They brought it back to the cave, and everyone enjoyed it. They were thrilled, obviously, to be having meat. But as my Zadie would say, that wasn't the end of the story. He would always say it with his finger up like this. It wasn't the end of the story. So they went back in the early 90s, and they were talking to the villagers and asking their name. And one man said he was Levitsky. So my grandfather asked if he was the one who had a farm up on the hill. Now, excuse my Ukrainian, it's a bit rusty, but the man answered Tomigi. I think that's how you pronounce it, which means that's my grandfather. My Zadie turned to his brother Nissel and said, we have to pay him for the sheep. And they did. They gave him, I don't know, a $20 bill or something. Anyhow, going back in 2010 with my grandfather was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. I'm so grateful to Janet, Chris, and my family and work for helping to make it happen. My grandfather and I flew with the rest of the family to Germany and from there to the Ukraine. I'm a grandchild of 4 Holocaust survivors. And when we arrived in Germany, I found it very hard to hear my name said with a German accent. But my grandfather wasn't fazed by hearing the German language at all. He was very comfortable conversing with the people around him. However, when we arrived in the Ukraine, he was visibly upset. Hearing the language spoken really disturbed him. And I realized because it was some of his Ukrainian neighbors who were the aggressors to him and his family. However, interestingly, when we arrived, the locals were kind to us. We visited the town. One of the villagers tried to give my great uncle's daughter, Lila, a live chicken. She landed up leaving with a bag of apples instead. We got to see the town where my grandfather grew up, where my great-grandmother grew up, and even the well that my great-great-grandfather had built. We actually, after a lot of searching, we were able to find the granddaughter of the person who had hid my grandmother. So that was very special. But the crazy thing was that nothing had changed. It was really still a little village. We went to visit the first cave, but the first cave wasn't the cave. It didn't have water. It was a known location. They were only there for 6 months because they were found. The second cave was the cave. Their local non-Jewish friend Munko had seen a fox run into a hole and suggested they check there. And this is what led my grandfather and his family to discover one of the biggest caves in the world. It was huge, had water, a few little lakes in it, and no one knew it existed. This was their safe haven, their protection. And the stories were all told to me from this perspective. So going back to the cave was not like when I went to visit Auschwitz or when I've gone to Holocaust museums. Going back to the second cave was like walking into their fortress or castle. It was like a magical place I had heard about all my life, and suddenly I was going in, which took a lot of convincing. Chris, thank you for your help. My grandfather did not want to let me go in. To get into the cave, as you heard, we had to crawl through a few narrow tunnels, and then we arrived in this large open space. Here's a photo of me glimpsing the large space for the first time, and you could clearly see the wonder and awe in my face. So you also heard that it was, they tried to have the survivors come in. The team had created a harness system, but as it was just too difficult. But I believe my grandfather was so grateful that I was able to go in his place. Him seeing photos of me touching the millstone, which that he and his brother, they carried on their backs. It was really full circle. One of the most critical things that kept him alive, him and his family alive, was suddenly being touched by his granddaughter, his brother's grandson. It was very special, incredible. Inside the cave, in addition to the millstone, I got to sit in their sleeping quarters. My great-grandmother would refer to this as the covered wagon. You could see where I'm standing. You could see the shape of it. Really looks like the dome of a wagon. And you could also see the shape where I'm sitting sort of awkwardly. So I obviously hadn't seen the film yet because it wasn't made yet. And at one point when we were in the cave, I also said, let's turn off all the lights. And, you know, my grandfather, to him, I guess he said, it feels like home. But to me, the darkness was so terrifying. And this is really what they lived with every single day. It's really so unbelievable how they survived, how many of them, and the length of time that they were underground. Since our family exited the cave, the descendants have grown to be a family of at least 100. I think there's a family photo coming up. Am I correct? Oh, sorry. Here's a few pictures of me. That's a mug that they found. And then if we go to the next, this is a photo from 2005. It is not the entire family. And thank God we have grown significantly since then. And this is really all because of the strength and courage of my great-grandmother, Esther. So, and here's a photo of me and my grandfather. This was before we went to the cave, I believe, because I was not covered in mud. Anyways, thank you so much for listening to their story and for remembering. And I'll now pass the floor back to Olivia.
Well, the chat box is flooded with questions, and I'd like to invite the audience to continue adding to the questions. Right now, I'm going to briefly tell you about upcoming programs of the Susan Mendes Foundation. Then we'll have a little trailer for an upcoming program, and that should give you plenty of time to continue formulating your questions. So we have 4 more programs, Sunday programs, in 2022. And then we have a whole new season planned for you for next year. Let me tell you that next year we will have programs not quite so frequent as we've had the past 2.5 years since the pandemic. There was a time when we were doing these programs every single week, but now that the world is opening up, we're doing more in-person events, and that means we are going to be cutting back on our Sunday programs. And so we are going to be offering season tickets, but we are lowering the price accordingly. So in the past, it's been $360 to get a season ticket for all of our Sunday programs for the whole year. And this time we're going to offer season tickets for $250. So hopefully that makes it more affordable for people. And again, we will be presenting extraordinary stories, as you well know. So next week, we will be presenting a story having to do with the ship, the St. Louis. But since we honor heroes and rescuers, we're going to be focusing on the heroes, the rescuers of the St. Louis ship. And those were the captain, Captain Gustav Schroeder, who was named a Righteous Among the Nations, because he worked assiduously with the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and their European representative, Morris Troper, to find other places for these passengers to go aside from Hamburg, Germany, once the ship was turned back. So they were able to have 4 other countries accept these passengers and rescue many of their lives. All the ones who ended up in England survived, and the ones who ended up in Belgium, France, and the Netherlands survived in the same proportion as other Jews from those countries. So we're going to be focusing on the heroes of the ship, the St. Louis, next week. The week following, we're focusing on a Catholic nun. Her name was Sister Rose Thering, and she has been called a saint in two religions. She was an extraordinary figure that you will all want to know. We're going to be showing a film about her called Sister Rose's Passion that was nominated for an Academy Award. And it tells the story of this woman from the Midwest, an American nun, who made it her life's mission to expunge anti-Semitic teachings from the Catholic Church. And she was doing this in the 1950s, and her work led directly to the Vatican II conference of the 1960s, and in particular to one clause of the Vatican II proclamation, which was called Nostra Aetate, which redefined the official relationship between Catholics and Jews. So she had a monumental impact on Catholic dogma, and we think you should know about her. So right now we're going to show you not exactly a trailer, because there is no trailer for that film. We're going to show you a little clip of an interview that the filmmaker made with the TV host, Charlie Rose.
It's that time of the year. Academy Awards are upon us. This year, 5 films received Oscar nominations for the documentary short film category. Among them is Sister Rose's Passion. It is the true story of a fearless nun dedicated to changing the way Catholics see Jews. Here's a look at the film.
At one time, my father and I were driving through Plain, and he whispered to me, "We have a new pharmacist, and I think he's Jewish." And I said, "Daddy, why did you whisper that?" And I didn't get an answer from my father. And then I asked my mother, "Who are the Jews?" "Why is that?" "Because I read here that the Jews killed Christ, killed Jesus. And who are the Jews?" Well, she told me again, they are the people that killed Jesus. And that was in my books. And then I said, "Why can't Jews get to heaven? Why do you ask me? It says here that the Jews have to wander around the face of the earth without a homeland of their own. Why can't they get to heaven?" "Because they killed Jesus."
Joining me now is the film's director and producer, Oren Jacoby. I am pleased to have him to talk about this rather remarkable film. Welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you, Chuck.
How did you find out about Sister Rose?
It's an incredible story. It's every filmmaker's dream to find a character that's a great character, and even better, a story that hasn't been told. And I was very lucky. Some other filmmakers, Steve Califer, Peter LeDun, Kelly Pfeiffer, 3 filmmakers from New Jersey, knew Sister Rose, knew what a great story she would make for a documentary, and approached me about working with them to make this film. And I have to confess, at first I was a little reluctant. I heard a story about an elderly woman. She's a professor emerita at Seton Hall University, but doesn't get out as much as she used to. And then I met her, and I realized what a powerhouse she was, and how determined she was, and what a extraordinary soul she really is, because she's a woman with incredible determination, and a woman who, when she recognized that there was something about the faith that she devoted her life to, that she cared really deeply about more than anything, and that bothered her as seeming to be something unjust, she had to do something about it. And when I got that sense of her story, I had to do the film.
Great. So that will be our program in 2 weeks on November 13th. And after today's program, you will get an email with information on how to sign up for that and other upcoming programs. So now let's turn to your questions. And question number 1 is, who came up with the title for the film?
I came up with the title of the film, but the credit all goes to Esther Sturmer, because in the book she writes, "There was no place on earth for us."
Wow.
And that seemed like a truly poetic title for the film.
Now, all of these objects, these artifacts that were found in the cave, where are they now? Is there a museum? Is it under attack in Ukraine? Where are these objects?
Well, I can't comment on where they are for the last 4 years, but where we left it at about 4 or 5 years ago is Cliff Sturm and I formed an organization with the local cavers, and we actually had the young kids there. And the idea was the grandchildren of those and great-grandchildren of those that lived above the cave were going to work hand in hand with the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those that lived in the cave to try to get these artifacts, and put them in a local museum on display. Well, it never quite evolved. And then we had COVID. And long story short, the local museum didn't have the funds to build these cases that you can control the temperature and humidity. So you can't just take the artifacts out into the open because they'll be destroyed. So most of the artifacts, we will photograph them, we will map them, meaning Peter Taylor and I and subsequently other cavers, and put them right back in the ground. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, Shahatsky, the curator of the local museum, he came up with kind of an ingenious alternate plan. Vataba is the first cave, and that's been under the control of the museum for many decades, basically. And they have walkways in there with handrails, and they had little alcoves where they would put the artifacts from Vataba on display. So what he started to do was he started to make dedicated alcoves in that cave that has electric lighting and move some of the artifacts from pre-Grotto cave into Vataba cave. So that way these things are still in the right humidity and temperature. But to do this job properly, they need the funds to put some display cases in the museum. So many of these artifacts now, they're right back in the ground to protect them, and they've been mapped. We know where they are.
There's someone in our audience who is interested in perhaps bringing some of these artifacts to a Holocaust museum. I mean, is there any possibility of that with the war raging as it is? Probably not, right?
Well, I think Jack can talk about the difficulty of getting permits there, especially if it relates to not just filming, but removing anything from the country. And that was back 10 years ago. Now, I don't think there's a chance. But
Olivia, I will say that one thing that's just happened now is that Lila Sturmer, Sam's daughter, who went back with the group, she, I had been given an incredible map of the Sturmer compound and all of their hiding places that she and her father drew. I don't know, Erin, if you know that, they drew.
No, I would love to see it.
Yeah, and I still have a copy, but there was a second copy. And then they also, Sam and she together mapped the entire village of Karlovka, family by family name. So I deal with occasionally with the Holocaust Museum in DC. So I called them, and they normally only take donations of actual physical objects from the time, but they have taken a donation just within the last month of this map of the Karlovka mapped out, and with Lila's permission, and also of your grandmother's house. And Erin, I will show you both because I still have one copy.
I look forward to seeing it.
That's incredible. So there's a question about how they got these objects in the first place, the bedding, the utensils. How did they get these objects?
So they brought them in. They brought things from their own homes, especially into the first cave. They even, my great-grandmother brought dowries for her daughters into the caves, into the first cave. Unfortunately, in the first cave, they were found. They were too scared to go back in, so they lost most of their stuff. In the second cave, they brought in down to make blankets, like with rags. They ended up making some pillows and blankets. And yeah, they brought everything in. And to get food, which I guess is sort of the follow-up question, most of the time they bartered, they bought. Sometimes they stole. They tried to steal from people who weren't kind to them. But they thankfully had some money to be able to purchase.
Let's see, other questions having to do with the fear of the dark, claustrophobia. I mean, I'm interested in the long-term effects on these survivors mentally, from a mental health standpoint. I mean, obviously they had true grit, all of them, but there must have been long-lasting effects. Were there?
Well, okay.
I was just going to say, for me, it's obviously very hard to comment because, you know, I just knew them as who they were. They were very, my grandfather was a very, very strong person, as was his brother Sam. Unfortunately, his brother Nissel passed away before I was 12 or 13 when he passed away, or maybe 14, but he was already a really old man then, so I didn't know him, the true Nissel, I believe. They were strong. Hold on, I just see a question. How did they go from, how did they go out from the cave to get these items? It was just a follow-up from the question that I previously answered. They would go out at night and get the items. When they went physically into the cave the first time, they brought stuff with them. And sorry, going back, Olivia, to what you were just saying, what you were asking, the effect on them, I think in general, Holocaust survivors have a strength to them, a crazy strength to them. My other grandparents too. And Chris, you were also going to answer the question. You probably had a perspective.
Yeah, Seema, for example, she told me once she never wanted to be hungry again, and she always kept a little candy or something in her purse. Mm-hmm. Sonia, along with Dorothy Kopf, a member of the Rebel family, they were both about 9. When they needed to calm down, they would find comfort in darkened rooms of the house. Dorothy was doing okay, as far as I know, in Philadelphia, never locked any of the doors in the house except the front door. Saul Wexler, I got very close with Saul. He's the first survivor I met. And identified 19 sources of guilt with Saul. And I hate to use the word typical survivor guilt because there's nothing typical about that. But I discovered that the young boys, the ones that were between 11 and 14, they came out of that cave, including Lusa Rebel, the 12-year-old brother of Mundik Rebel. They, to me, came up with the most mental baggage. And I think I figured out why. There's a scene in the movie where I think Sonia Seema said the scariest time was when the men went out of the cave because nobody would know if they would come back. And she went on to say, we didn't say anything about it, but we thought it. Well, what happened is the young boys like Lusa and Sal, they weren't men. They were still boys and they felt it. They would get looks. And the looks would be, well, why aren't you out there with your brother? Why aren't you out there with your father? And it affected them in the long term. They took the biggest hit, those young boys. And I used to spend time with Saul Wexler at a camp. It was a summer camp, upstate New York. And on one side of the camp, you had the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors doing typical camping skills and everything. And then on the other side, you had the seniors. Well, I used to take the kids caving on the Saturday morning, and then they wouldn't know the surprise at night. I would bring them over to the other side of the camp, and I would give them a presentation about the Sturmers and the other people living in the cave. And then I would introduce them to Saul Wexler. It was an amazing relationship. But one night, one afternoon, Saul didn't come to lunch. And I found him in his room, with the curtains drawn in the dark, sitting in the corner of the floor. And he was all shaken up and he had tears in his eyes. And he said, "You caught me in my cave." And he said he took a lot of mental things out of that cave. And he said, you got to understand, when we came here, we didn't have money to go to get psychoanalyzed. He said, I had to go learn English. And then by day, I was getting a quarter an hour. And at night, here I am, like 15 in classes with 12-year-old kids. So it was very hard, he said, and we had to deal with our own mental baggage the best way we could, and they did.
And Olivia, just not to make this too long, is that I would say to the audience is that doing this film, I learned that everyone's experience, a traumatic experience, is very different depending on their age and position. So to Erin describing her grandfather as this incredibly strong person is, I think that the young men who went out of the cave came out of this thinking that they could do anything. And they came to Canada and accomplished amazing things in business, starting from nothing, because they were true heroes every day to the people they went back with and did things that no one believed were possible. And exactly as Chris says, if you were a young boy, asked to step up way beyond what your age was, it was a totally terrifying experience across families. And if you were a small child, you were with your grandmother and your mother, and you were somewhat protected in a place. You didn't know what was happening outside. And so your experience was different. So depending on who you were, I think people took very different emotional baggage, or frankly, actually emotional strength out of that cave.
Now, this story came so close to being completely lost to history. And now, thanks to all of you, you're preserving this memory, you're preserving history, and that itself is very heroic. So, Erin, do you have some final thoughts you would like to share with our audience today?
Well, I just want to thank you for sharing the story. It really was my great-grandmother's wish for our family story to be shared. So I'm grateful for everyone to have watched and taken the time to listen. People always ask, why wasn't the story shared before? And the truth is, I don't think they thought people would believe them. So thank you, Janet and Chris and Olivia, for believing, obviously, for sharing the story. Thank you everyone for watching and hearing, especially now with the recent rise in anti-Semitism. It's so important for us to remember all these stories and to make sure that this doesn't happen again, not just to Jewish people, but really to try to not let it happen to anyone. So thank you very much.
Janet, what would you like to say to our audience in closing?
I think of this story first as a story of incredible female leadership. They would not have survived without Esther Sturmer's brains, strategic thought, and leadership. She was the core leader, and it's really interesting that it was a woman at a time when people didn't expect women to be leaders. Secondly is the group always does better than the individual. Is everyone in that cave who was above a certain age fulfilled a really important role. The oldest Sturmer son had been in the cavalry and was beyond brave and physically strong and also a leader. Saul was a master carpenter. He created the grindstone. He created the entrance to the cave and things that his brother couldn't do, right? And it goes on, is that we are all better for the group. And in the end, I remember reading long before this, Viktor Frankl's book on meaning. And in the end, it is our connection to other people that helps us survive. And that is, as Chris said, what drove all these people is they had each other and they worked beyond imagination to survive for each other and their community.
Chris, the last word goes to you.
Okay, so what did this mean to me, a non-Jew? This project lasted well over 20 years. When I was growing up, I heard about the atrocities committed against Native Americans. I heard about the evils of American slavery. And I heard about the number 6 million. To be honest with you, back then it was just a number, whether it was 5 million, 6 million, or 7 million. Now, I hate to quote somebody like Joseph Stalin at an event like this, the leader of the Soviets at the time, but he once said something to the effect that the loss of an individual was always a personal tragedy. thank goodness the loss of millions is nothing but a mere statistic. And I can tell you, after doing numerous interviews of many of the people that you saw in the video and that we talked about tonight, looking in their eyes, trying to get just an idea of what they went through, all the time knowing that as a non-Jew, the one thing I could never say is, I get it, I understand. Well, eventually I got it. And what I got was the Holocaust was never one individual story about how 6 million people perished. It was 6 million individual stories of fathers, lovers, classmates, grandparents, as are all genocides. And at that point, that number 6 million took a completely new meaning in my life, and it's still somewhat overwhelming today. That's what it meant to me. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank our amazing panelists and, of course, our loyal audience that comes week after week. Audience members, I would like to encourage you to sign up for the last 4 programs of the year. Registration is open for all 4 programs, so please go ahead and sign up. And thank you for joining us and giving us some of your Sunday. Come join us again next week and in the weeks to come. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Be well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.